الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء سيدنا المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, tonight we are beginning with our second lesson in the Imams of Hadith. Last week we took the tarjuma, the biography of Imam al-Bukhari, rahmatullahi alayh. And today we're moving on to Imam Muslim. Imam Muslim. And of course, we always begin with who they were in terms of their name, their ism, their kunya, so we can know who they actually were, the actual names. Right? His kunya, rahimahullah, is Abu al-Husayn. Abu al-Husayn. Which means that he had a son named Hussein, right? La. Actually, he didn't. But he became known by this name. He was famous by this name. Alright? And he took this as a kunya. He did have children, however. Okay? He did get married and he did have children. However, he never had a son. Alright? He had many children. But all of his children were daughters. Okay? Al-Hakim, rahimahullah, he says, I saw from the progeny of Imam Muslim that he had daughters. وَلَمْ يُعْقِبْ ذَكَرًا. And he never had any sons. Alright? And some people, they may see this as something that is to be disappointed about, as was the way of thinking of the mushrikeen al-Arab, the Quraysh. Right? Whenever they had a daughter born to them, you see their faces what? Muswadda. They change, right? Because they didn't see it as a good thing. However, the A'imma al-Kibar, such as Imam Ahmad, whenever he had a child and it was a daughter, he used to tell himself something very special. And whenever his companions had children and they turned out to be daughters, he used to remind them with something special. And he would say to them, as is reported by his son Salih, he said, كان أبي إذا ولد له ابنة يقول إن الأنبياء كانوا آباء البنات. Verily, the prophets, the messengers, used to be, for the most part, fathers of daughters. The prophets and the messengers. And it's reported by Ibn al-Qayyim in his kitab تحفة المولود, لكن بدون إسناد, without إسناد, لكن نذكره للفائدة. He says, Ya'qub ibn Bakhtan, whenever he had a child, and he had 7 daughters, never had a son. Whenever a daughter would be born, he'd go to Imam Ahmad. دخل على Imam Ahmad. Why? In order to bring his grief, his disappointment. And Imam Ahmad would say to him, verily, the Anbiya were fathers of daughters. Verily, the Anbiya are fathers of daughters. فَكَانَ يُذْهِبَ قَوْلَهُ حَمِّي. And what he used to tell me would relieve my stress. Alright? Now, his actual name is Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, ibn Muslim, ibn Walad, ibn Kawshad. Okay? Al-Qushayri al-Naysaburi. Author of the Sahih. Alright? The most authentic book. طبعا after the Kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Sahih al-Bukhari. And we mentioned that last week. After that is Sahih Muslim. Okay? He also wrote a kitab called At-Tamyiz, which is a very important book in its bab, which helps teach how to differentiate between ahadith that are authentic and ahadith that have hidden mistakes in it. Alright? And he wrote many other books as well. Imam al-Dhahabi said about him, he is the great Imam, the Hafid, the Hujjah of Islam, the proof, the testament of Islam. Alright? What is it called what does it mean when someone's called a Hafid? Anyone know? He's a memorizer of hadith, and not just any memorizer. Okay? Of course, when we say hafiz today, it means someone who memorized the kitab of Allah. Right? But that's something that was already expected of you back then. You didn't get no special title because of that. But not everyone memorized 300,000 ahadith, for example. 400,000 ahadith. 500,000. Then you were called hafiz. Alright? So he was known as a hafiz. He was from Naysabur. Alright, which during his time was one of the centers of knowledge in the Muslim world, and is specialized in learning and taking hadith. وَلِذَلِكَ Imam al-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, when he would speak about Imam Muslim in his Sirah Alam al-Nubala, and that he's from Naysabur, he would say Darul Isnad wal Awali, or Darul Hadith wal Awali. Okay, Naysabur, the place of hadith, not just any hadith, Awali hadith, yani Ali Isnad. Okay, those special ahadith where people would travel to from all around the world in order to get that short chain between themselves and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right. Later, when was he born? The historians, they all agree that Imam Muslim, he was born after the year 200, but they differ as to when exactly. Okay? وَفِيهِ قَوْلًا. There's two opinions. The first one is the most well-known and documented opinion of when he was born, and that is in the year 204 after Hijrah. Okay? This was the view of As-Suyuti and Ibn Kathir and many others. لكنه قول مرجوح. But it's not the correct opinion. انتبه. Okay? Although this is one of the most well-known facts of Imam Muslim, that he was born in 204, but this is incorrect. And we'll mention why. Okay? This leads us to the second view. And that is that he was born in the year 206 after Hijrah. Alright? And this was the view of Al-Hakim and Naysabur. But why is it the correct view? Because of what Al-Hakim himself says. Al-Hakim, he says, I heard from my Shaykh Ibn al-Akhram. Okay? Ibn al-Akhram was someone who was living during the lifetime of Imam Muslim. In fact, he was someone who wrote a book based off of Sahih Muslim. So he lived during Imam Muslim's time, and he was a specialist in the works of Imam Muslim compared to those who came later on. So obviously, his qawl is what? أقرب إلى الصواب. It's more closer to what's correct. Okay? And Ibn al-Akhram, he said, توفي مسلم ابن الحجاج رحمه الله عشية يوم الأحد. Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, he passed away on the eve of Sunday. ودفن يوم الاثنين, he was buried on a Monday. لخمس بقية من رجب, 5 days remaining in Rajab. سنة إهدى وستين ومئتين, in the year 261. وهو 55 سنة. Okay, he died in 261, which everyone agrees on, and he was 55 years old. Like, now we do the math. 261 minus 55 gives us 206. Okay, so that's how we reach the conclusion that he was born in 206. So he was born in 206, he died in 261 at the age of 55. And Imam Muslim, he grew up in a household of knowledge, just like all of these ai*imma. Alright, and he learned first from his own father. Okay, and his father was a sheikh, was a muallim, he was an educator and a teacher and a scholar himself. The student of Imam Muslim, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab al-Fara, rahimahullah, he himself says, وَكَانَ أَبُوهُ الْحَجَّاجِ ibn Muslim min مَشْيَخَةِ أَبِي. Imam Muslim's father used to be my father's teacher. Okay, my father's sheikh. So Imam Muslim, his father also was a well-known scholar during his time as well. Okay, so no doubt, the fact that he had a father like this was going to be a great influence on Imam Muslim in the direction that he heads later on in his life. Okay, and he encouraged him to seek knowledge. Unlike other Imams like Bukhari, we don't really have too much information as regards to the early studies of Imam Muslim. Okay? But it's safe to assume that just like everyone during their time, they began in the kutab, learning how to read and write, memorizing Quran, and only then they would move on to seeking hadith. Okay, so it's safe to assume that. Imam Muslim, one of the things that's mentioned in his biography are the things, his physical traits, how he looked like. Okay? Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi, he said, كان تام القامة. He used to stand very tall and straight. أبيض الرأس واللحية. His head and his beard were white. يلقي طرف عمامته بين كتفيه. And he used to extend or wear the end of his turban between his shoulders. Okay? So Imam Muslim was someone who was known to wear a turban and have a tail hanging in between his shoulders. Alright? Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami said, رَأَيْتُ شَيْخًا حَسَنُ الْوَجْهِ وَالثِّيَابِ. I saw a shaykh who was very handsome and wearing fine clothing. عليه رداء حسن. Okay? وعمامته قد أرخاها بين كتفيه فقيل هذا مسلم. Alright? He said, I saw a shaykh who was very handsome, who had very nice clothing and a cloak, and the tail of his turban was hanging between his shoulders, and it would be said, this is Imam Muslim. Alright? And this was usually the style of the ulama back then, that they would wear a turban, especially when teaching. Alright? As for his seeking of knowledge and seeking hadith, then Imam al-Dhahabi, rahimahullah, he says, وَأَوَّلُ سَمَاعِ مُسْلِمٍ سَنَةَ 18 He first began to sit and hear hadith in the year 218 after Hijrah. So how old was he then? 12 years old. Alright? So he already finished Quran by then. Now he was sitting with the big boys in the hilaq of hadith, learning hadith and taking it from different mashayikh in his hometown. Alright? And the first person that he took hadith from was Yahya ibn Yahya al-Naysaburi. Yahya ibn Yahya al-Naysaburi is one of the main ones who took the Muwatta from Imam Malik directly. Okay? So if you go to the shops today and you buy the Muwatta of Imam Malik, it's going to say on it which riwayah, which narration, this is from which one of Imam Malik's students. One of the main ones is Yahya ibn Yahya al-Naysaburi. Alright? He then went to take knowledge from all of the mashayikh in his town, exhausted all of them, and then he went on to begin traveling outside of his town. Okay? And of those mashayikh that he learned from was one of the greatest scholars of hadith, Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. Alright? Who was Ishaq? Ishaq ibn Rahawayh, or Ishaq ibn Ibrahim as his real name, was the teacher of Imam al-Bukhari. He's the one that gave Imam al-Bukhari the idea to write the Sahih. Alright? Imam al-Bukhari one day was sitting in a majlis as a young man, and Ishaq said, if only someone would gather together the ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ that are only Sahih. Imam al-Bukhari says, فَوَقَعَ ذَلِكَ فِي قَلْبِي. That went straight into my heart. Alright? So they shared in some of the same mashayikh. And this is very important to keep in mind, as we'll bring something that we need to mention later on. Okay? So one of his teachers was Ishaq ibn Rahawayh. Also Qutayba ibn Sa'id. Alright? And we will inshallah mention his relationship with some of these mashayikh. In the year 220, now at the age of 14, he makes Hajj. Alright? And this was what? In order to benefit from the ulama in Mecca. And this was also their customs. Alright? After exhausting the mashayikh in their town, now they would make Hajj, and at times they'd stay. Like Imam al-Bukhari, we mentioned last week, he made Hajj with his brother and his mother, and his mother and his brother went back home, but he remained in Mecca. Alright? So he makes Hajj in order to learn from the ulama in Mecca and benefit from them. And when he was done with Mecca, now he went on to Medina. Okay? Now he went on to Medina to begin and learn from the mashayikh there. On his way back home, he stops in Kufa to learn and take from the mashayikh there. And he also went to Baghdad. And he learned there from who? One of the greatest mashayikh in hadith. Who's in Baghdad? Anyone know? Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Alright? He stops in Baghdad and he takes knowledge from Imam Ahl Sunnah, Imam Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. Alright? And Imam Muslim, one of the things that sticks out about him is that he's one of the most traveled Imams of Hadith, such as Imam Abu Dawud. Imam Abu Dawud and Imam Muslim were some of the most well-traveled ulama. Others didn't get to travel much. Alright? Imam Bukhari, he traveled. Imam Ahmad, he traveled, no doubt. But not like Imam Muslim. He went to Kufa, to Basra, to Baghdad, to Ray, to Naysabur. Every place that you can go to seek knowledge during that time, he entered. And he entered it more than once. Remember, I said that he was married and he had daughters. Yet this was a man traveling the Muslim world, gathering ahadith, memorizing ahadith, grading ahadith in order for me and you to benefit from today. He has a family. He didn't have to. Right? But he left his wife, he left his daughters, and he went and sought knowledge in order to preserve the sunnah for those that would come after him. Alright? And one of his travel partners was someone by the name of Ahmad ibn Salama, who was also very important in the life of Imam Muslim. Okay? Just like last week we mentioned, Imam al-Bukhari, one of the people who was very important in his life was Abu Ja'far al-Warraq, okay, his secretary. But Imam Muslim had a travel partner, Ahmad ibn Salama. Alright? And his name will come up as well later on. Okay? He was the one who, along with Imam Muslim, got up and stormed out of the class of who remembers from last week? Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali. Okay? Imam Muslim and his travel partner Ahmad ibn Salama were the ones that stormed out of the class. Alright? As for the praise from the scholars, okay, one of the things that is mentioned about Imam Muslim was that he was a merchant. Okay? He had a job. Okay? He owned a business in which he sold dry goods like seeds, nuts, dates. Alright? He used to sell this stuff in order to support himself. This is one of the beautiful things about the A'imma back then. Right? They weren't employed, right, by any masjid or any government. Rather, they hated to take that route. Okay? Instead, they would be self-employed, make their own money. Imam Ahmad used to go out, chop wood, carry it on his back into town and sell the wood. Imam Bukhari had a business. Imam Malik was in business with his brother. Likewise, Imam Muslim, he sold dry goods in one of the marketplaces in order to get money, and that is how he used to sustain himself and his family. Alright? قال أبو عمرو المستملي, Abu Amr al-Mustamli, he says, أملأ علينا إسحاق الكوسج سنة 51 ومسلم ينتخب عليه. Abu Amr al-Mustamli, okay, this is one of the titles that you often find mentioned in the books of hadith. What is a mustamli? Mustamli is someone who dictates or announces something. Alright? You often wonder, how is it that a scholar of hadith sits in a gathering and teaches hadith when in his gathering is 50,000 people, for example, 20,000. How do they all what? Hear what he's saying when there's no microphone? They would have this position called a mustamli, where someone, and often a close student of the shaykh, would stand on the side, close to where he can hear what the shaykh is saying. And when the shaykh says the hadith and that student hears it, he now shouts it towards the people in the back, where another mustamli is waiting. And he takes it and also passes it on to those further back, and so on. Right? So this was the job of Abu Amr al-Mustamli. He says, Ishaq al-Kawsaj was dictating to us a hadith. And this was in the year 251 after Hijrah. All the while Imam Muslim in that gathering was correcting him. So the Shaykh, is dictating a hadith, Imam Muslim would what? Raise his hand. Sheikh, actually it's like this. And nicely, respectfully correct the Sheikh. And the Sheikh, he says, Abu Amr, he says, فَنَظَرَ إِلَيَّ إِسْحَاقُ وَقَالَ فَنَظَرَ إِلَيْهِ إِسْحَاقُ وَقَالَ لَنْ نُعْذِمَ الْخَيْرِ مَا أَبْقَاقَ اللَّهُ لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ. He looks at Imam Muslim and he says, we will never be deprived of any goodness as long as Allah keeps you alive for the Muslims. Alright? Because he's correcting his Shaykh. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the student of Imam Muslim, he says, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj was from the scholars of all the people and from the vessels of knowledge. I know nothing of him except goodness. Okay? And even his own teachers used to praise him. Alright? It's something when your students praise you, but it's something different when your own mashayikh, your own teachers praise you. Alright? Muhammad ibn Bashar, يعني al-Gundar, who's known as Gundar, said, حافظ الدنيا أربعة. Or حفاظ الدنيا أربعة. The hufad of the entire world are 4 people. Abu Zur'ah in Ray, Muslim in Naysabur, Abdullah al-Darimi bi-Samarqand, wa Muhammad ibn Ismail bi-Bukhara. Okay? 4 of these people are the hufad of the dunya, and of them he mentioned Imam Muslim. Alright? وقال أبو عبد الله محمد بن يعقوب بن الأخرم الحافظ إنما أخرج نيسابور 3 رجال محمد بن يحيى Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj وإبراهيم ibn Abi Talib. This great scholar Ibn al-Akhram, he says Naysabur produced in its time 3 great huffaz, 3 great men. Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali, who we mentioned, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, and Ibrahim ibn Abi Talib. وقال أحمد بن سلمة رأيت أبو زرعة وأبا هاتم يقدمان مسلم على مشايخ أسرهما أو على مشايخ أسرهما. Abu Salama, he says, I witnessed both Abu Zur'a and Abu Hatim al-Raziyan يقدمان, put ahead or rank Muslim ahead of all of the mashayikh of their time. Okay? That's something very special. Why? Because who were the ones that did that? Abu Zur'a and Abu Hatim. Okay? One of the greatest, or 2 of the greatest ulama of hadith and huffaz. Possibly, above Muslim themselves. They are above Muslim. Alright? Yet, they are ranking Imam Muslim as one of the most knowledgeable scholars in what is sahih from da'if in their time. And Imam Ahmad ibn Salama also says, سمعت إسحاق ibn راهوي ذكر مسلما فقال بالفارسية كلاما معناه أي رجل يكون هذا. Ishaq ibn Rahowi, he says, or Ahmad ibn Salama says, I heard Ishaq saying in Farisi, not in Arabic, but in Farisi, who in the world is this man? Pointing to Imam Muslim. Alright? His students, who were they? They include the likes of Abu Isa al-Tirmidhi. Okay? Al-Tirmidhi was the student of Imam Muslim. Ahmad ibn al-Mubarak, Abdul Rahman ibn Abi Hatim, Ibn Khuzaymah, and many others. Okay? As for his mashayikh, some of which we've already mentioned, others were the likes of Bukhari himself was his teacher, Ali ibn al-Madini, Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali, Al-Qa'nabi, Yahya ibn Yahya, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and others as well. Alright? Now, for this lesson, or for tonight's lecture, what we want to do is we want to focus on his relationship with some of the mashayikh that he had. Alright? Because this is something that is mentioned in the biography of Imam Muslim. The first of his closest shuyukh, okay, as we mentioned, Imam Muslim was from An-Naysabur. Naturally, he's going to learn from the mashayikh there. And the one imam, the one great scholar that was in Naysabur during that time was Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali. Okay? Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali, this was one of his main scholars, main teachers. So Imam Muslim naturally got to spend a lot of time from him and learn a lot of ahadith from him. Alright, and benefited from him. Now, one of the things we mentioned last week was that because of the issue that happened between Muhammad ibn Yahya and al-Bukhari, what did Imam Muslim do? He cut off all that relationship that he had. In fact, he returned all the ahadith that he learned from Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali back to Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali. Right? In protest and siding with Imam al-Bukhari. The reality is, this happened more than once. Alright? This happened another time earlier on, before Bukhari even came to Naysabur. What was the situation here? It's mentioned by Maki ibn Abdan. He says, وَافَى داود ibn Ali al-Asbahani Naysabur أيام إسحاق ibn Rahaway فَعُقِدَ لَهُ مَجْلِسَ النَّظَرِ. This great scholar by the name of Dawood ibn Ali al-Asbahani came to Naysabur. And he was a great scholar. فَعُقِدَ لَهُ مَجْلِسَ النَّظَرِ. What did they used to do when a scholar came to town in order to welcome them? Not just test them, but what would they do? A gathering of hadith. Right? So they set up a gathering of hadith in order to welcome this scholar, Dawood ibn Ali. Alright? Now, there are two different types of gatherings of hadith. And we're going to see this throughout the story of Imam Muslim. Alright? When they set up this gathering of hadith, the narrator Makki, he says, وَحَضَرَ مَجْلِسَهُ يَحْيَى ibn Duhali وَمُسْلِمْ ibn al-Hajjaj. Two people came to that gathering. Muslim and the son of Muhammad ibn Yahya. The son of Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali. Okay? فَجَرَتْ مَسْأَلَةً تَكَلَّمَ فِيهَا يَحْيَى فَزَجَرَهُ داود قال أسكت يا صبي. Okay? An issue of knowledge came up. Okay? A discussion started. And the son of Muhammad ibn Yahya spoke up. But the teacher felt like it wasn't his place to speak, so he told him, be quiet, oh young boy. Alright? This is not your place. وَلَمْ يَنْصُرُهُ Muslim. Okay, Muslim stayed quiet. He didn't say anything. This young man, the son of Muhammad ibn Yahya, he goes home now. And he tells his father, the Imam of Naysabur, what happened. And he says, okay, as it goes, فَرَجَعَ إِلَىٰ أَبِيهِ وَشَكَى إِلَيْهِ دَاود فَقَالَ أَبُوهُ وَمَنْ كَانَ ثَمَّ. Who was in that gathering along with you? قَالَ Muslim وَلَمْ يَنْصُرُونِي. And he didn't even come to my assistance. Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali becomes outraged at this. Imam Muslim is his student. Why didn't my student stand up for you? So he says, قَدْ رَجَعْتُ عَنْ كُلَّ مَا حَدَّثْتُهُ بِهِ. I take back all the ahadith I ever told him. Allah. When this reaches Imam Muslim is not the type. His personality is not like, he's going to go to the Shaykh and be like, Shaykh, I'm sorry. La la. Yo, he's got his personality as well. He says, okay, that's the case. So he gathers all the ahadith in a basket and he takes it back to Muhammad ibn Yahya himself. That was the first occasion where he gave the ahadith back to Muhammad ibn Yahya. I often like to mention, you guys, when we talk about the ulama, the imams, the scholars, sometimes we have like this maybe fairy tale way of thinking about them. Keep one thing in mind. They were the best of humans. At the end of the day, they were still what? Human. Alright? At the end of the day, they were still human. They got upset, they were happy, they got sad, right? So Imam Muslim had a very strong personality, just like Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Duhali did. And oftentimes when you have two people like that, they often what? They clash. Alright? However, that was the first occasion and they made up. Alright? They made up. Later on is when the issue with Bukhari happens, when Bukhari comes to town. And at that time, when he returned the ahadith back to Muhammad ibn Yahya, did he do so in a basket? La. It was so many ahadith, he couldn't carry it himself. He had to put it on a donkey. And he sent the donkey back to Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali. And he returned what? The ahadith to him. Alright? Now, as a result, he never narrated any ahadith from Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali. You're not going to find in Sahih Muslim any hadith that comes from that path. Alright? And many of the ulama, they criticized him because of this. Abu Zur'at al-Razi, he said, if only Imam Muslim stuck it out with Muhammad ibn Yahya, لَصَارَ رَجُلًا, he would have become a man. Alright? He would have been a real man. ولكن هذا يعني فيه مبالغة. There's some exaggeration. Why? Because just until last week, maybe many of you never heard of Muhammad ibn Yahya. But all of you have heard of Imam Muslim. And that is why Imam al-Dhahabi, right, he says, فَمَا ضَرَّهُ ذَلِكَ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ. And that did not harm him whatsoever in the sight of Allah. Because Imam Muslim still turned out to be Imam Muslim. Alright? The next relationship that he had with one of the mashayikh, or his closest mashayikh, was with Imam al-Bukhari. Alright? As we mentioned, he left Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali in order to stick with Imam al-Bukhari. Alright? So, he had a very close relationship with him. And no doubt, this was probably his closest teacher. His closest teacher. Alright? And when Bukhari came to An-Naysabur, Imam Muslim remained with him like his shadow. And he stayed with him, benefiting from him in every way he possibly could. To the point where some of the ulama, such as Ad-Darqutni, says, لولا البخاري ما جاء مسلم ولا راح. Okay? If it wasn't for Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim would have never turned out to be anything. Okay? Showing you how much he benefited from Imam al-Bukhari. Alright? And Ali al-Qari said, ولم يزل مسلم يستفيد العلوم من البخاري ويتبع آثاره في تقريره وتحريره ويتردد إليه ويقبل يديه لوصول فوائده. Right? He says, Imam Muslim did not stop benefiting from Bukhari, following his footsteps, adopting his views and opinions, continuously visiting him. He would kiss his hands and continuously benefit from him. Right? More specifically, one of those sciences that Imam Muslim benefited from Imam al-Bukhari in was one of those specialties in the field of hadith called ilm al-ilal. Ilm al-ilal. The science related to how to spot and pinpoint the hidden mistakes in a hadith. Right? At times, a hadith may have a mistake which is zahir. It's very easy to see. Right? You look at a chain and there's a huge gap. One is, someone is reporting from the Prophet ﷺ when he lives in the 4th century. Obviously there's what? Missing link. Right? That's very easy to see. But sometimes a hadith may have a defect, a mistake in it, a weakness which is very difficult to find. That is the field that Imam Muslim benefited from Imam Bukhari. Alright? Now, Abu Hamid al-Amash, he says, we were sitting in a gathering with Muhammad ibn Ismail al-Bukhari. And Muslim came along. In that majlis, someone recited a hadith. They said, Hajjaj ibn Muhammad reported to us from Ibn Jurayj, from Musa ibn Uqba, from Suhail ibn Abi Salih, from his father, from Abi Hurairah, that the Prophet ﷺ said the dua of what? Kafarat al-Majlis. Everyone knows the dua, Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. That dua, that hadith was mentioned in this gathering. Imam Muslim, he gets up and he says, is there any hadith, is there any isnad in the world better than this isnad? He was so amazed at it. Imam Bukhari, he looks at him and he says, إِلَّا أَنَّهُ مَعْلُولٌ. Unfortunately, it has a hidden defect in it. But Imam Muslim didn't catch the hidden defect in this report. But his teacher, Imam Bukhari, did. So Imam Muslim, he says, لا إله إلا الله أخبرني به. لا إله إلا الله, tell me what it is. For Imam al-Bukhari, he says to him, Ustur ma satarahu Allah. Don't worry about it. Okay? In a way to entice Imam Muslim. Continue asking. You gotta beg me a little bit. And so Imam Muslim continues to push his sheikh. Please tell me what it is. Please tell me what it is. Until Imam al-Bukhari tells him. He mentions, he says, Musa ibn Uqba, who's mentioned in this hadith, never heard a hadith from Suhaib. Right? So there's the hidden break right there. In addition to that, he said, this sanad is not even the proper sanad that links to this hadith. And he gave him the actual sanad. Alright? He says, Musa ibn Ismail from Muhaib, from Musa ibn Uqba, from Aoun ibn Abdullah, from the Prophet ﷺ, and Aoun is a tabi'i. So if Aoun is reporting from the Prophet ﷺ, that means there's what? A gap, a break. Alright? So not only were two of the narrators in between them missing a narrator, but the hadith ends at a tabi'i. So there's more than one break in this chain. Okay? So what does this mean? Imam al-Bukhari, he weakened that hadith. And Imam Muslim followed him in that as well. طيب. Now I'm not going to sit here and tell you all that dua, kafarat al-majlis, is weak. La, that's not what I'm trying to say here. The ulama of hadith are very specific when they weaken a hadith. They are weakening this path, this chain to the hadith. But there are multiple other routes and paths that lead to that hadith which are reliable. Okay? Which are reliable. But they were discussing only this one. Alright? And that is what they weaken. Imam Muslim at this point, he gets up and he says to Bukhari, لا يبغضك إلا حاسد وأشهد أنه ليس في الدنيا مثلك. No one hates you except someone who's jealous. And I bear witness that there is no one equal to you in the dunya. He says this to his teacher, Imam al-Bukhari. In fact, he goes on to say, دعني حتى أقبل رجليك يا أستاذ الأستاذين يا سيد المحدثين يا طبيب الحديث في علله. Please allow me to kiss your feet. O teacher of the teachers. O master of the muhaddithin. O specialist in the field of hidden defects in hadith. Ilal al-hadith. Alright, so we can see that he benefited a great deal from his teacher Imam Bukhari in this field. Alright? So, after mentioning all of that, alright, what's surprising is that we find that Imam Muslim, just like with Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali, he never narrated a hadith from his teacher, Bukhari. How does that make any sense? You leave Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhali, you abandon him for Bukhari, and then you don't narrate from Bukhari in your Sahih. What's going on here? The ulama, of course, they have the answers to this. There's a reason. Alright? Some of the reasons, and we'll mention a few of them, alright, is one of the reasons, as I said, is that Imam Muslim, okay, when Bukhari came to Naysabur in that last part of their lives, and he learned from him at that point so much, Imam Muslim was already done writing his Sahih. Alright? And this is the conclusion that one of the mashayikh today, Sheikh Mashhur Hassan Salman in Jordan, one of the students of Sheikh al-Albani, this is the conclusion he reaches after his research. He says Imam Muslim was already done with his Sahih. So there was no reason to go back and edit it and revise it. So, the Sahih of Imam Muslim today reaches us with no ahadith that he narrates from Bukhari. This is the first reason. Okay? There's another reason that is mentioned. And that is that according to some of the scholars, alright, as we mentioned earlier on, Imam Muslim, he narrates ahadith from the same mashayikh of Imam al-Bukhari. طيب, think of it this way. If I and a partner of mine, okay, we narrate from the same shaykh, but I also narrate from my friend, am I going to now narrate the hadith from the path of my friend and leave the path of the shaykh? La. Why? Because now I'm going to be adding another person in the chain. I'm better off narrating a hadith with shorter chains. So because he didn't have to narrate through the path of Bukhari, he himself narrates from the Shaykh of Bukhari. So he didn't want to include in his Sahih a hadith which have longer chains. So he left the hadith of Bukhari. Right? A third reason is mentioned. And that is that there was an issue that arose between Imam Muslim and Imam al-Bukhari towards the end of their life. Alright? And of course what we mean by a disagreement or an issue is a knowledge-based disagreement. Alright? Not some petty differences or personality issues. La. An issue they had over what? Ilm. In the introduction of Sahih Muslim, alright, we can see that Imam Muslim, he speaking very harshly about someone he doesn't name. Alright, there's some shots fired in the introduction of Sahih Muslim. Obviously, it's, as we said, about something based about hadith. Alright, what that issue is would take a long time to explain. We don't have time for that. But he doesn't mention who he's talking about. But some of the ulama, they said, he's speaking about Bukhari. Right. As a result, he didn't bring the hadith of Bukhari in his Sahih. Alright. Now, towards the end of Imam Muslim's life, there was an interesting incident which took place. In fact, it's an incident which led to his death. Alright. Ahmad ibn Salama, the student, he says, عُقِدَ لِمُسْلِمْ مَجْلِسْ الذَّاكِرَةِ. There was a majlis, a gathering of hadith that was conducted for Imam Muslim. Okay? So far we've mentioned two types of majalis of hadith. Majlis al-nadar or tahdith, and majlis al-mudakara. Okay? One is where everyone, all the students, are allowed to enter. This is where they're actually learning the hadith. Majlis al-tahdith. Okay? Then there's the majlis, which is more special. It's what? Private, to the main students. In which all they're doing is revising a hadith with one another. This is the type that was set up for Imam Muslim. Okay? The majlis where they're revising a hadith with one another, with their teacher. فَذُكِرَ لَهُ حَدِيثٌ لَمْ يَعْرِفُهُ. And in that gathering there was a hadith that was mentioned that Imam Muslim never came across. And this is a big deal. Why? Imagine you memorize 500,000 hadith. And one comes along that you never heard of. That's going to stop you dead in your tracks. You're going to look into that hadith. You're going to investigate that hadith. So this is what Imam Muslim does. فانصرف إلى منزله. He goes home. وأوقد السراج وقال لمن في الدار لا يدخل أحد منكم. He goes home immediately. He turns on his lantern, his light, and he tells his family, none of you enter this room tonight. He goes into his library. He's going to look for this hadith. Tonight, leave me alone. But before he goes into his research, his wife comes to him and says, أهديت لنا سلة التمر. Listen, a basket of dates was gifted to us But let me just put it out for you, at least, before you go into your library and disappear. Okay, so he said, okay, no problem. Bring the basket of dates. فقال قدموها فقدموها إليه فكان يطلب الحديث ويأخذ تمرا تمرا. Okay, تمرة تمرا. As he's going through his books, looking for this hadith, what is he doing? He's taking a date from the basket, eating it, takes the seed, puts it aside. Takes another date, eats it, puts the seed to the side. All night he's doing this. Looking for this hadith, which is what? Keeping his mind busy, not paying attention to anything else. طيب. فأصبح وقد فني التمر ووجد الحديث. By the time the morning came, he found the hadith, alhamdulillah. The basket of dates was empty. Ahmad ibn Salama, he says, زادني ثقة من أصحابنا أنه منها مات. It's mentioned in the مقدمة of Sahih Muslim, Sharh Sahih Muslim by Imam al-Nawawi. Ahmad ibn Salama, he says, and this is, right, it was reported to us from some of the people we trust. Because of this, he died. Yani, Imam Muslim overdosed on dates. In his search for hadith. They traveled for it. They lived for it. And they died for it. Literally. This is the death of Imam Muslim. That because of this research, he ate a basket of dates. It filled him up to where he probably became poisoned by it. Allahu Akbar. But this is how he passed away. Rahmatullah alayhi. Okay, and he died in the year 261, as we mentioned. طيب. I believe we still have a few minutes. Inshallah. It wouldn't be right if we didn't speak about the kitab that he wrote. Alright? We didn't get to mention Imam al-Bukhari's Sahih last week, but inshallah tonight we'll just mention a few points related to the actual book that he wrote and he left behind for us. Alright? Firstly, as we mentioned, this is the second most authentic book after the Quran, after the kitab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then after Sahih al-Bukhari. Okay? قال مكي ابن عبدان سمعت مسلما يقول عرضت كتابي هذا المسند على أبي زرعة فكلما أشار علي في هذا الكتاب أن له علة وسببا تركته وكلما قال إنه صحيح ليس له علة فهو الذي أخرجته. He says about this book of his, after I was done writing this book, I presented it to Abu Zur'ah. Every hadith that he pointed to and he said, in it is a hidden mistake, and he gave me the reason behind it, I took it out of the book. And every hadith he told me, there's no problem with it, it's authentic, this is the book that I presented to you today. He says, وَلَوْ أَنَّ أَهْلُ الْحَدِيثِ يكتبون الحديث 200 سنة فمدارهم على هذا المسند. He says, and if the people of hadith continue writing hadith, learning hadith, teaching hadith for the next 200 years, they're going to come back referring to this kitab. And even more so, we're still referring to it today. Not just 200 years, over 1,000 years. He says, alright, and because of this, actually, it led some of the scholars to take the view that Sahih Muslim was in fact more authentic than Sahih al-Bukhari. Alright? Some of the scholars, such as Abu Ali al-Naysaburi, who said, ما تحت أديم السماء كتاب أصح من كتاب مسلم. There is no book under the sky, and no book on earth, more authentic than the book of Imam Muslim. Okay? Now, why would he say such a thing? Alright? This is obviously what is incorrect. Okay? Majority of the ulama, they say that the kitab of Sahih al-Bukhari is more authentic than Muslim. La shak. Alright? But this was the view of Abu Ali al-Naysaburi and some of the scholars of the Maghrib. Okay? The Maghrib al-Islami. But what we can say is that the book of Imam Muslim, أحسن, it is أحسن من Sahih al-Bukhari. It is more better. Yani in terms of what? In terms of its organization. It's tartib. It's much easier to read than Bukhari. Right? You open up Imam Muslim's book, you're going to find all the ahadith about salah in the chapter of salah. The ahadith of zakat in the chapter of zakat. You open up Bukhari, you got to know how to read Bukhari. Why is this hadith in this chapter? It's not so obvious. Obviously, there's a reasoning behind it. Right? But it's not easy to read for the average person. Whereas Kitab Sahih Muslim is. It's much more easier. So it is أحسن, lakin it is not أصح. Alright? The author, he didn't title it Sahih Muslim. Just like Bukhari didn't title his kitab what? Sahih Bukhari. Imam Muslim, he titled his book As-Sahih al-Musnad. As-Sahih al-Musnad. Alright? What do each one of these terms mean? When someone says As-Sahih, then obviously it's in reference to the ahadith in that book being authentic. Checked, verified. And the ahadith being Musnad means that it comes with a fully connected chain between himself, leading all the way to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Alright? And he said, I authored this Al-Musnad As-Sahih from 300,000 hadith that I heard. Okay? So from 300,000 hadith, he selected and then he placed into this book. Alright? قال أحمد بن سلمة كنت مع مسلم في التأليف صحيحه 15 سنة. I was accompanying Imam Muslim while he was authoring his kitab for 15 years. It took him 15 years to author this book. It wasn't authored overnight. Just like Bukhari authored his kitab in 16 years. Right? It took Imam Muslim 15. قال وهو 12 ألف حديث. And in it is 12,000 ahadith, meaning with its repetition. But if you were just to count without the repetition, it's 4,000 ahadith. Alright? But we will, I believe, end here. But we will lastly, inshallah, just mention why he wrote this kitab. Okay? And he mentions it in the introduction. This is one of the beautiful things of Sahih Muslim. That he wrote an introduction to his book. Many scholars didn't. Like Bukhari, he didn't write no introduction. But Imam Muslim did. So we know exactly why he wrote it. Okay? Because he states it himself. He says, in response to a request made by a student. He says, if Allah wills, we will begin to extract and compose what you have asked upon conditions which we will mention to you. And he mentions in the kitab his conditions related to his book. Okay? So because a student asked his sheikh to write this book, he wrote it. Never underestimate what request you can put forward to a student of knowledge or to your sheikh. Because many of the books we rely upon today were written due to the request made by a student. And also due to the lack of books that separated between Sahih and Da'if during his time is another reason why he wrote this kitab. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have mercy on Imam Muslim and to reward him for his work that he did for Islam. جزاكم الله خيرا. صلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.